Today I'm continuing to read from The Story of Classic Crime in 100 Books by Martin Edwards. Today is part 9. Chapter 5. Miraculous Murders. A dead body is found in a locked room. Murder has been done, and yet there is no sign of the murderer. Perhaps not even of a weapon. It is an impossible crime. For how can it have been committed? The appeal of this puzzling paradox is intense and enduring. Locked room mysteries have fascinated and entertained readers for as long as detective fiction has been written, while apparently impossible crimes have in recent years featured in popular television series as well as in novels written not only by English-speaking writers but also by French and Japanese authors such as Paul Halter and Soji Shimada. Locked room and impossible crime stories flourished during the Golden Age when ingenuity of plotting was so highly prized. John Dickson Carr, the Anglophile American who is universally acknowledged as the supreme master of the locked room mystery, summed up the appeal of these stories with a typical gusto. When we find ourselves flumdiddled by some masterstroke of ingenuity which has turned our suspicion legitimately in the wrong direction, we can only salute the author and close the book with a kind of admiring curse. Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841 and generally regarded as the first detective story, posed a fascinating problem for Poe's great detective, the Chevalier C. Auguste Dupin, to solve. A woman was found dead in Paris, her body locked inside a room from which there appeared to be no means of escape for her killer. Yet this was not the first locked room story. 3 years earlier, Sheridan Le Fanu had published a passage in The Secret History of an Irish Countess anonymously. Although this spooky story can scarcely be described as detective fiction, antecedents of the locked room mystery may also be discerned in Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, and E.T.A. Hoffman's novella Mademoiselle de Scuderi, 1819. Wilkie Collins' short story, A Terribly Strange Bed, poses a situation faintly reminiscent of that in an episode of Christian de Troyes' Lancelot of the Knight of the Cart, written in the 12th century. In the final decade of the 19th century, Israel Zangwill's The Big Bow Mystery, 1892, earned widespread acclaim, while Arthur Conan Doyle's superb Sherlock Holmes story, The Speckled Band, also exploited the potential of the locked room mystery to an excellent effect. Even Joseph Conrad dabbled with an impossible crime scenario similar to Collins in his story, The Inn of the Two Witches. The 20th century saw a host of writers conjuring up ingenious variations of the impossible crime. Among the more talented were the American Jacques Futrelle, creator of Professor SFX Van Dusen, alias the Thinking Machine, who was the epitome of a cerebral great detective, and Francis Gaston Leroux, author of The Mystery of the Yellow Room, 1907, whose detective was a journalist called Joseph Rouletabille. In Britain, G.K. Chesterton regularly confronted Father Brown with seemingly impossible crimes, a device which enabled him to indulge in his love of paradox. Many Golden Age novelists, including Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, and Ngaio Marsh, found themselves unable to resist the challenge of concocting stories about apparently impossible crimes, while Anthony Wynne made a specialty of them. The prolific Frank King, the pseudonym of Clive Conrad, published 4 locked room mysteries, notably Terror at Stop's House, 1927, in which the loathsome and miserly old Amos Brancard, a receiver of stolen property, gets his comeuppance in a sealed room one stormy winter's night. The best work of Virgil Markham, son of poet Edwin Markham, brims with youthful daring. Death in the Dusk, 1928, set in Radonshire, on the border between England and Wales, combines an extraordinary plot with lashings of Gothic atmosphere. In the prefatory notes, one character whets the reader's appetite for the puzzle by describing it as a compendium of the bedevilment of Parson Lawley, the mad behavior of the milkman, the invisible omnipresence of Sir Brooke Mortimer, the enigma of the mystic bone, the legend of Sir Pharamond's imperishable arm, and the machinations of the ultimate contriver. Even this list omits the fiendish cat of the sisters Delambre. The key twist, although not wholly original, is cleverly disguised. Shock, 1930, known as the Black Door in the US, was subtitled The Mystery of the Fate of Sir Anthony Varian's Heirs in Kestrel's Erie Castle near the coast of Wales, and features a seemingly impossible disappearance. The Collins Crime Club first edition described the book as a super thriller and included not only a map of St. David's and Ramsey Island, but also a highly elaborate pull-out family tree detailing the descendants of Horace Varian of Coriston Park, Westmoreland. The Devil Drives, 1932, concerning death by drowning in a locked cabin, is also highly regarded, but Markham's output as a detective novelist extended to a mere 8 books, the last appearing in 1936. John Dickson Carr enjoyed a much longer career. In 3 successful series, he rang variation upon variation his favorite theme. Dickson Carr was an Anglophile who set most of his mysteries in Britain, although like Markham and many other leading exponents of the impossible crime story, he was American. Carr's closest rival as a specialist in miracle problems was a professional magician called Clayton Rawson. Rawson's great detective was also a magician, the great Merlini. Writing as Stuart Town, Rawson created another sleuthing conjurer, Don Diavolo. Henning Nems, also American, wrote one of the finest impossible crime stories, Rim of the Pit, 1944, under the name Hake Talbot. The rapid decline in popularity of this type of story after the Second World War is illustrated by the fact that the next Hake Talbot novel never found a publisher. The inherent artificiality of the impossible crime device might be thought to make it ill-suited to any fiction with pretensions to a degree of realism. But as ever with detective fiction, all is not as it seems. Impossible crimes feature in books focusing on psychological suspense, such as Helen McCloy's Mr. Splitfoot, 1968, and police procedurals, including Ed McBain's 87th precinct novel Killer's Wedge, 1959. Parwalu and Mudge Swojwal produced a series of 10 police novels that amounted to a Marxist critique of Swedish society, which proved hugely influential, and Swojwal, sometimes described the godmother of the Nordic noir, has picked as her favorite the 9th of the books, The Locked Room, 1973, in which an investigation of a robbery is combined with Inspector Martin Beck's attempt to discover the truth about the death of a man found in a locked room. Any idea that locked room mysteries ended with the demise of a golden age of detective fiction was put to rest by the latter part of the 20th century and the early years of the 21st, by successful television series on both sides of the Atlantic such as Ben and Sick, Monk, Jonathan Creek, and Death in Paradise, and an international appeal of an apparently impossible crime has been confirmed by the popularity of Soji Shimada's The Tokyo Zodiac Murders, published in Japan in 1981, but not translated into English until more than 20 years later. It is a striking example of a story that combines Golden Age trappings, such as a locked room mystery and a challenge to the reader, with startling descriptions of violence that to Anthony Wine and John Dickson Carr would have been unthinkable. The Medbury Fort Murder by George Limnelius, 1929. A memorable setting, strong characterization, and sound plotting distinguished George Limnelius' crime-writing debut. This locked room mystery begins quietly, with background and characters sketched at some length, when Major Hugh Preece of the Royal Army Medical Corps is consulted by a subaltern called Lippian. His realization that he has encountered the man before triggers memories of past indiscretions. As a young man, Preece had become infatuated with a ruthlessly ambitious showgirl called Prunella Lake. The outbreak of war brought their relationship to an end, and they both married other people, although a subsequent reunion had far-reaching consequences. In the meantime, while serving in West Africa, Preece had seen his friend and colleague Victor Wape kill a man but escape punishment. Old sins cast long shadows, as Preece discovers when he begins a stint as medical officer at Medbury Fort. The fort lies on the Thames estuary, one of the chain of forts forming the Thames and Medway defences, before improvements to coastal defence artillery rendered it obsolete. Preece and Victor Wape are thrown together with Lippian, and a subaltern soon reveals himself to be an unscrupulous blackmailer who has learned Priest's darkest secret. Priest finds himself driven to contemplate Lippian's murder, and he devises a plan inspired by Israel Zangwill's famous locked room story, The Big Bow Mystery, 1892. When Lippian is duly found dead in almost precisely the circumstances envisaged by Priest, Scotland Yard is called in. It soon emerges that Priest has something to hide, but a sequence of plot twists complicate the investigation. Priest proves not to be the only man present at Medbury Fort with a reason to kill Lippian, and the police are confronted with an unexpectedly testing puzzle of character, means, and motive. The cast of suspects is small, but Limnelius handles his narrative with aplomb, engaging the reader's sympathy with both the hunters and hunted, and his no-nonsense treatment of sex and violence is hardly in keeping with the lazily conventional view of golden age fiction as cozy, and the attention he pays to characterization is equally striking. Why the novel has been often overlooked by historians of the genre is itself a mystery, but its merits were long championed by the late Robert Addy, the leading expert on locked room mysteries and impossible crime stories. The authentic flavor of military life conveyed throughout the novel provides a clue to the author's real identity. It is evident from the wealth of detail that Limnelius is painting an insider's picture of the army. His real name was Lewis George Robinson, and during the course of a long and distinguished service career, he rose to the rank of colonel before retiring due to ill health. He published a handful of novels, including The Manuscript Murder, 1934. As the title of The General Goes Too Far, 1935, indicates, he continued to mine his experience of soldiers and their way of life for his fiction. But The Medbury Fort Murder remains his outstanding contribution to the genre. Murder of a Lady by Anthony Wayne, 1931. Set in the author's native Scotland, this intricate story opens in fine dramatic fashion with the procurator fiscal calling late one evening on Colonel John McCallan. He brings news that Mary Gregor has been stabbed to death in nearby Duckland Castle. I have never seen so terrible a wound. The dead woman was found crouching by her bed, but there is no trace of a murder weapon. The door of the room was locked, and so were all the windows. A second murder follows, and suspicion shifts around a small cast of suspects. The book's alternative title, The Silver Scale Mystery, refers to the puzzling presence of herring scales at the crime scenes. Luckily, McCullen is playing host to Dr. Eustace Haley, who has a knack of solving apparently impossible crimes. The puzzle is cleverly contrived, and the explanation is not, as is often the risk with a locked room mystery, a letdown. Haley maintains that detective work is like looking at a puzzle. The solution is there before one's eyes, only one can't see it, because some detail, more aggressive than the others, leads one's eyes away from the essential detail. His focus was on criminal psychology, and in particular, the special stresses to which the murderer was subject prior to committing the crime. Haley enjoyed a long career as a sleuth, first appearing in short stories in the mid-20s and making his final bow in Death of a Shadow. In an essay published in 1934, Wine explains Haley's preference for working independently of the police. My studies of crime are undertaken only because they interest me. I follow a line of investigation often without knowing exactly why I am following it. It would be intolerable to have to justify and explain every step. Unexpectedly, he adds that the detection of crime, I think, is an art more than a science, like the practice of medicine. His creator, like Haley, knew a good deal about the practice of medicine. Wine's real name was Robert McNair Wilson, and he was a Glasgow-born physician specializing in cardiology who served as medical correspondent of the Times for almost 30 years. His publications range over a variety of scientific, medical, and historical subjects. Politics fascinated him, and he twice stood unsuccessfully for Parliament as a Liberal Party candidate. Another abiding interest was economics, discussion of which intrudes into a novel with a teasing impossible crime scenario, Death of a Banker, 1934. The first edition dust jacket blurb mused that it is possible that most of us, at one time or another, has contemplated the murder of a banker. In this novel, Mr. Wayne shows us how it should be done, provided, of course, that there exists no Dr. Eustace Haley to undertake the solution of the crime. In the same year, Wilson published his less racily titled work of non-fiction, Promise to Pay, an inquiry into the principles and practice of the latter-day magic, sometimes called high finance. The definitive study of this subgenre, Locked Room Murders by Robert Addy, lists no fewer than 23 books and stories written by Wine, which feature impossible crime elements, typically involving death by invisible agent. The Haley mysteries often display considerable ingenuity, but never match the popularity of John Dickson Carr's novel featuring Dr. Gideon Fell and Sir Henry Merriweather. Carr's stories derive much of their appeal from the lashing of the macabre and splendidly evoked atmosphere and a good deal of humor. By contrast, Wine's stories often lacked verb. Murder of a Lady is enjoyable enough to suggest that this was due to a lack of ability, but to his writing too much, a recurrent failing of Golden Age writers. The Hollow Man by John Dickson Carr, 1935. John Dickson Carr wastes no time in telling readers The Hollow Man, published as The Three Coffins in the US, what lies in store for them. In a dazzling first paragraph, he proclaims that the murder of Professor Grimaud and the equally impossible crime in Cagliostro Street were as baffling and terrifying as any in the casebook of his sleuth Dr. Gideon Fell. Two murders were committed in such a fashion that the murderer must have been not only invisible but lighter than air. According to the evidence, this person killed his first victim and literally disappeared. Again, according to the evidence, he killed his second victim in the middle of an empty street, with watchers at either end. Yet not a soul saw him, and no footprint appeared in the snow. The puzzles are skillfully constructed, but what lifts the novel into the highest rank of classic mystery is Carr's flair for creepy atmospherics. Vivid descriptive writing, coupled with a host of small, deft touches, even names like Grimaud and Cagliostro, have a memorable quality. Contribute to the overall impression of baffling unreality. The crimes appear miraculous. Might a vampire be involved? The book was originally to be called Vampire Tower, yet it is the promise of rational solution which makes the story so gripping. In an extraordinary bold move, Carr allows Fell in chapter 17 to address the reader directly, giving a disquisition on the locked room mystery that has often been reprinted as an essay on the subject. We are in a detective story, and we don't fool the reader by pretending we are not. Let's candidly glory in the noblest pursuit possible to characters in a book. When I say that a story about hermetically sealed chamber is more interesting than anything else in detective fiction, there is a merely prejudice. I like my murders to be frequent, gory, and grotesque. I like some vividness of color and imagination flashing out of my plot. Since I cannot find a story enthralling solely on the grounds that it sounds as though it might really have happened, Fell proceeds to offer an analysis of different types of locked room scenarios so impressively detailed that it has never been surpassed. Gideon Fell's fast physique, rumpled appearance, and larger-than-life personality were conscious tributes to G.K. Chesterton, whom Carr much admired. Dorothy L. Sayers, one of the most perceptive reviewers of detective fiction, spotted the parallels. Chestertonian also are the touches of extravagance in character and plot, and the sensitiveness to symbolism, to historical association, and to the crazy terror of the incongruous. This is a remarkably assured novel, displaying, in addition to its flair and originality, the craftsmanship of an author who had already published more than a dozen books to widespread acclaim. Astonishingly, however, John Dickson Carr wrote it before reaching the age of 30, and this reflects a truth about Golden Age detective fiction that has often been overlooked. Much of the best work of the period was produced by relatively young writers whose boundless energy and zest contributed significantly to the quality of the books and their daring. Carr's career as a published novelist began impressively with It Walks by 1930, which introduced the saturnine French investigator Henry Bencolin. Many of his books about Sir Henry Merriweather, another detective with a flair for solving impossible crimes, equal the Fell novels in terms of quality. A notable example is The Judas Widow, 1938. The Merriweather books were generally published as Carter Dickson. He also wrote as Roger Fairburn. After the Second World War, he turned increasingly to historical mysteries, and his final book, The Hungry Goblin, 1972, sadly not in the same league as his early masterpieces, features Wilkie Collins as a detective.